Welcome to the ISM Western New York Lunch and Learn webinar series. Please be sure to participate during today's program by inserting any comments or questions in the chat box that you may have for our speaker. Today, we are excited to welcome back our speaker, Brandon Hummons. Brandon has both his CPSM and CPSD, and he is also a board member with ISM Chicago. I will actually let him expand on his background when he begins. Our topic for today's discussion will be negotiating with leverage, how procurement can create value before the first supplier conversation. At this time, I'll now turn the program over to you, Brandon.
Thank you very much for that, Kathy. And once again, it's fantastic to be back. I love working with this chapter and spreading all sorts of procurement knowledge to my peers across the country here. So, as Kathy said, I'll do a quick introduction about myself and then we'll go ahead and jump right into the topic. I've been in the procurement world now for about 15 years or so. I started off in the insurance space as a senior category manager at Allstate, bounced around to a couple different insurance and financial based companies. And then in 2019, I got into consulting, started my own Hummons consulting procurement practice. And now I'm with Valorant, where I have been consulting with them for a little over 2 years now, working with various clients like Okta and other tech-based companies. But then I am moving roles within Valorant and somewhat transitioning out of Hummons consulting and primarily focusing on helping procurement teams optimize the way that they work internally with their stakeholders as well as with their suppliers. And I can tell you guys a little bit more about that at the end here. But needless to say, let's jump right into things. As Kathy said in the beginning, please feel free to ask questions, put them in the chat box. I'll do my best to monitor that. Kathy, if I'm not seeing any messages come through, feel free to call me out on it. I'd be happy to pause and move forward to answering some questions from there. So, why
Definitely.
are we doing this topic, negotiating with leverage? Negotiating is something that we've talked about several times before. And I think that this is a session that is a good reminder of certain things that you need to do when you're thinking about negotiating those more strategic deals overall. Now, when it comes to why negotiation is the focus here, we're also talking about stakeholder management. If you think about your most successful negotiations over time, you might imagine that it came with you being very closely aligned with your stakeholder group, right? And when we think about the idea of negotiation, what is it? It's something that you do all the time. I've got a couple real life examples, and I want you to start thinking about your own life and how you negotiate in various aspects. But most importantly, pay attention to the leverage that you had going into that negotiation, right? So think about those moments when you're debating with your kids about when bedtime is or trying to get them to eat all the food on their plate, right? That is our daily life when we're negotiating. However, when that switches to the workplace, things get a little bit more complicated, a little bit more weight on some of those decisions that you're working with. So we negotiate sometimes with our internal stakeholders. How do we make sure that we understand that we're capturing their needs versus their wants? And then obviously we have those supplier deals, the main piece of our negotiating lives, and then enterprise procurement overall. How do we develop the strategies for that negotiation, right? Not just the one outcome that we're looking for, but the series of various outcomes that lead to that overall objective that we're trying to achieve here. So here's the quick example that I think about for our normal everyday lives, right? My wife, for example, loves to use Instacart, right? And if you never use Instacart, similar to Grubhub or any sort of meal delivery system, right? There are times when if she subscribed to, let's say, for example, Instacart Plus, they remove a lot of those fees that are associated with that app. However, not every fee goes away. So when I sat down and I looked at our monthly budget, I said a couple things. Well, one, sometimes we're doing Instacart 1 to 3, maybe even 4 times a day, right? Because we're looking at it sometimes as very little fees to get involved. Why not get a case of water delivered if we're out? Why not get our toddler a little bit more milk before we had to sleep without having to run to the store? Those fees add up, right? Those are the invisible pieces of engaging with a supplier that we don't typically see. When I did the math on it, if we give them even a $1 or a $2 tip on a $10 delivery. One, it might be seen as a little wasteful to only get $10 worth of food delivered to your house. However, if that's your lifestyle in terms of maybe you are medically induced to have to stay home, maybe you can't travel to the closest store very often, maybe you can't leave the house for one reason or another. Maybe that's what you have to do. Just make sure that you understand what that means for the bigger picture. If there are $5 worth of fees that include things like tip or the app fee itself, $5 a fee running 2 to 3 times a day, you're easily spending hundreds of dollars a month, right? So, as a procurement person, we might look at a simple grocery run and we see that. We see the need for a plan before we head to the store. We see the need for a budget that's put together before we leave the door. And these are the typical everyday procurement actions that you do. You notice if you go to the store, they don't have your preferred milk, you may already have a substitute in mind, right? If you are looking for a particular purchase, you may do some research beforehand to get those coupons or any other savings vehicle ready for you. These are our normal things. And when we think about the procurement space, it's the same principle as we were using before with those everyday examples. We're just going to ramp it up quite a bit in terms of what's on the line for what we're doing. If we miss the bread, very little impact. We can simply go back and get more bread. And an organization, if we miss a termination clause and now all of a sudden we're locked in for the next 5 years, that's a little bit of a different stakes here, right? So when we think about the evolution of how this negotiation looks in our lives into the professional space, it follows that same path that I talked to you about before, right? That grocery store visit, it's very transactional, very direct. You go there, you get what you pay for. There's some strategy, right, that you still have involved. You still made your list. You still decided your budget. You still know your substitute. So it's not completely blind if you're doing it the right way, but it's just not that strategic. And then we move into the department buy, right? Let's say you're buying a birthday celebration for your procurement team, right? So once again, the stakes are up. You're now not just purchasing for you and your family that might be a lot smaller, but you're purchasing for many people. You have to consider their needs, their wants, their desires, their restrictions, their allergies, all of those different details. And then let's get a little bit more complicated, right? We're not celebrating a birthday in the department anymore. We're buying a new software. Let's say we're looking at Coupa or an Ariba or a main platform that you guys would typically gravitate toward. Now, all of a sudden, the level of detail that's required is starting to become robust. We need to understand the use cases for Coupa. How much are other companies paying for it? How long does their implementation typically take? Do we have the machines that are specced out to the correct way, right? So all of a sudden, we're starting to increase in our complexity. And then this Coupa tool, right, the software renewal or purchase was really just for our buying group, whether that's your buying procurement team or your buying stakeholders. And then we look at enterprise supplier deals. Think about your Microsofts, for example, something that everyone is going to use. And once again, the leverage that's required to have a successful negotiation from there has ramped up even more. So the things that we're still doing, though, stay the same. So this is the reminder, you're still asking questions, you're still being considerate, you're still factoring in the opinions, the wants, and the needs of the various people that will be impacted by your decision. We're just ramping it up. And that's where the meat of our conversation is going to start, right? This is where we start talking about how do you, with these super strategic or even super tactical purchases, ensure that you have the proper leverage. Now, I said at the beginning to think about an example of a situation where a negotiation went well and how your alignment, for example, with your stakeholders was in that particular negotiation. So, on the tactical side of things, as you think about your example, if we're not strategic enough, on the tactical side, we're only going to care about things like price, right? And I'll put all the things that you see on the left in that gray box into a real example, right? Let's take the Coupa one once again. Coupa should be a very strategic purchase. However, let's say you are in a broken environment, you need Coupa right away, so all of a sudden it's urgent that we get this done. Our POs are failing, we have suppliers that are not getting paid properly, and because of all of that pressure, your stakeholder group comes to you and says, we need Coupa tomorrow. Well, we might miss a few things in that process, right? We've lost the leverage of time. We are going to be focused solely on how can we get the best price in this position, because of that limited time and that increased urgency, we may not ask all of the questions to our stakeholders that we need to, nor will we collect all of the details that we would if we had an entire year to do that investigating and then that transition. Right. So we're on the tactical side of things. We're purchasing it. We're doing the best that we can to collect that feedback from our stakeholders, but clearly there are a few things that are missing. Conversely, if this is done right on the strategic side, we don't even start with a stakeholder coming to us and saying that, well, I want to buy Coupa. They come to us and say, I have a need to better provide services to my buying team as well as alignment with my external stakeholders like my suppliers. I want them to understand when they'll be paid, how they will be paid, if there are any limitations or obstacles in the way. We're starting so early that all the critical key questions we can ask both internally and potentially externally to those outside stakeholders. We're starting early enough to do that market intelligence and then to make adjustments or find alternatives if the need arises. Imagine they say, well, we want to buy this new procure to pay software, and Coupa's on the list, but after we do our investigating, our exploring, we find that maybe they aren't the best choice. Maybe we need to find a different partner for this based on our company's needs. Starting early, that's where we start to gain our leverage. But I want to dive deeper into what and how does that leverage come into play, and how can it directly impact that actual supplier negotiation? So I'm going to touch on a few things here in multiple areas, and then I want to show you guys at the end of this two things. One, I'm going to show you guys a dashboard that we use here at Valorant in order to get these things done properly. But the main reason I want to show you that is not so that I can show you some piece of technology that's going to solve your problems. However, I'm going to show you what you can and should be building at a rudimentary level before you step into your more strategic supplier negotiations. And what I mean by that is the technology that I'm going to show you, if you don't have the right process in place, get your process together first. Build what you need to build on PowerPoint or Excel or shared files in a drive. Build all of that manually. Find out that process that works for you, and then start to implement technology so that you're not layering over a sophisticated process on top of something that may already be broken in some ways. Before you even engage with that supplier at all, a heavy amount of research, alignment, strategy, and data needs to go into that process. The couple things that we're thinking about here, right, when we're thinking about how that conversation can go, and I'll show you a few things on the next slide, is how can we use that information to do a couple things. First, it'll set the tone. Once we have the right research, the right alignment down, we're setting the tone for the rest of the negotiation. If you can step into that first supplier talk cool, calm, and collected with all of these details at your fingertips, there's not a good chance that they're going to have to get over on you, to make you miss a few details, to maybe sway you in a different direction based on the facts that they have available. Imagine they have, well, I'll put it into a real perspective. Because I used Coupa before, I'll use them again here. Imagine you're negotiating with Coupa and you stepped into that without any of the 4 points that I mentioned before. You allow them then to guide that entire conversation. They tell you what you should be paying, right? They'll tell you, hey, this is going to be 1.2 million in your first year. Is that right? You don't know. You only are stepping in with the information that they're providing you. And you may think to yourself, well, what if I'm just using this as an intro call, Brandon? What if I'm just gathering data? Even when you're gathering data, you still want the baseline of information so that you know what feels right and what feels wrong. So imagine when AI spits something back out to you that you've been researching or that you want to write. The most common saying that I've heard is AI seems like it's turning out great results for people that don't know the answer. The less you know about something, the more confident you will feel about the answer that AI gives you. So when you're thinking about before that supplier engagement, the less you know about that supplier, their marketplace, the benchmark prices that you should be aware of before having that conversation, the less that you know about that space, the more influential you're going to be to the things that they tell you, right? If you don't know what the Coupa price benchmarking should be, they're going to be able to influence you much more strongly in whatever direction that they want. If you don't know what other companies are using or how they get the most out of their software, you're going to let that supplier guide that conversation and set the tone the way that they see fit. Another big piece here is going to be that alignment with your internal stakeholders. But once again, I'll talk about that in a second. And how about this? How about we actually just jump ahead and jump right into some of these first conversations that we'll be having, right? So I have the four pieces here overall. I want to mostly focus on what we see at the bottom. It really sums it up and brings it all together. Workflows, data, and decision support, right? The concept of these three pillars is how do I make sure that anything my stakeholder could ask me, I know the answers to those questions before the conversation happens. Second piece, who are my stakeholders and what could the information that they're looking for bring? Let's dive more into this. Let's once again use the Coupa example. Your initial stakeholder may be your head of procurement, the person who is going to be accountable and responsible for your team's outcomes. They may come to you and task you then with finding this new tool or being part of the team that is involved in that. The first step as procurement that we then want to do is align and say, all right, well, here's what the leader, the sponsor of this project wants to accomplish. Now, let's see how that alignment fits into the objectives of my other stakeholder groups. And here's a part that I don't have on the screen here that I'm going to tell you is extremely important for how you do this. The goals that you present to your stakeholder group must align to the goals and objectives that they are looking to accomplish. Other than that, change management and alignment starts to fall apart. So let's say, for example, you have the goal of transitioning from Ariba to this Coupa in this scenario here. If your CPO says, yes, this is what we want to do, we are going to be focused on speed, efficiency, and price. If we can hit those three markers, I'll be a happy person. Say, great, I'll put that at the top of my priority list. Then let's say you meet with a business group and they say, well, I understand that cost savings is important, but being able to have visibility into my supply chain and understand my inventory and where my inventory amounts sit, whether I'm at the beginning of my production cycle or at the very end, that is most important to me. Then let's say finance comes in and says, well, we need to know the depreciation rates of that inventory, how much is being used when, so that we can then modify what our inventory and our books say from an asset value perspective, right? So now finance is interested in inventory tracking. Legal says, all right, well, that all the cost savings and inventory stuff is fantastic. However, we on the legal side need to ensure that it can use our DocuSign properly. We don't ever send a contract without DocuSign. That integration is entirely important. And then IT may say, well, are they SOC 2 compliant? Are they GDPR compliant? Are we going to be protecting supplier and customer data as we interact with these vendors? And so on and so on. Now, the difficult piece here is we like to be kumbaya and say that everyone's needs are the same in terms of priority and weight. In the procurement world, unfortunately, that is not true. When it comes to the stakeholder alignment piece, part of your job then is to prioritize which stakeholders have more of an impact than the others. So if I'm on the operations side and I don't use Coupa at all I really care about is being able to do my job and not have any sort of slowdowns, and I don't have a ton of supplier interaction that's mostly going to be on the business, my priority for my input here may be way at the bottom of the list, right? Versus somebody like in finance who says, well, I have these critical needs that are here that if they are not included in this tool, I'm going to buy it somewhere else. Their priorities of their input may be a little bit higher than operations. Before I move on, I also want to talk about how the stakeholder alignment links in with your procurement expertise and what you then bring to the table. What I talked about with these various stakeholder groups, I'm still going to call that transactional and service level. And here's the reason why. I may have walked through each of the stakeholder groups and then decided on and gathered the right information on what are your needs, what are your wants, what's absolutely vital, what's your timeline. I have all the right questions here. It's still tactical. The reason why, in order to become strategic and in order to gain leverage, we then need to take a step back and look at why are these their requirements? Why are they saying that it can only be run through DocuSign? Why are they saying that it's important for us to track this inventory, right? Once we understand that why, we go up an even another level into the strategy about how that why came to be. The why came to be for documents being put through DocuSign because we had several situations where our stakeholders were signing contracts and they shouldn't have been. We have had several situations where suppliers submitted a signed contract to us, but it was 3 versions too early than the version we all agreed to sign, right? So all of a sudden, we're getting to the root causes of why our stakeholder groups want this. And then when we take it even further beyond into that strategic setting, we're saying, how does these set of actions, how do these wants, goals, desires, needs link back to business strategy? And that is where you as a procurement expert comes into play even further. You've already asked the right questions, you've already collected the right data, but now your job is to take that information, run it up, figure out how that connects to the strategy, start from the top again, and then start linking back down those high-level strategic objectives with what you are trying to accomplish at a individual contributor level from procurement. Brandon, what does this look like? That's super complicated. Okay, let's boil it down. I do this with an example, a real example from a previous role that I had at a very large pharmaceutical, or not pharmaceutical, fertilizer company. This would fit with the pharmaceutical example that I have too, but I'll tell you guys about that story another time. I was the senior indirect category manager at this company. So I was over all of indirect, HR, finance, sales, marketing, IT. And I had a dotted line up to the CIO, and I reported directly into the CPO at the time. I was tasked with putting together a comprehensive category management strategy that I would then present to the CIO. I put this together. I'm very proud of it. It went through all of my internal procurement checks. I've shown the CPO. They're great with it. They say, thumbs up, Brandon, go show this, get some alignment. I go into that CIO's office and I show her the category plan. I walk through, here's what we are trying to accomplish. Here's our savings goals. Here are our key critical suppliers that we'll be having quarterly reviews with. Here's everything that we're doing. And she said, Brandon, this is great, except for one part, your savings objective. I said, well, what's wrong with that? I'm trying to save 15%. And she said, well, I have a really big objective this year of migrating and upgrading our systems to SAP for HANA. And this is going to be a ton of work with our entire ERP system. And this wouldn't just touch the procurement and buying team, but also the sales team as well, because all of that folded back into that one center of truth, that one data lake for our SAP environment. So moving into SAP for HANA, the CIO simply stated, I do not want procurement's focus to be on saving money when my focus is on building and optimizing the organization. That will mean my senior directors who are tasked with completing these things are going to be so overly distracted by your push to get them to save money that they may go with the least optimal partner when it comes to implementing on certain projects. They may look at a critical software and decide that we don't need it when in reality we do, but there's cost pressures that now push us to say no. I took a step back at that moment and I said, all right, that makes sense. I'll pull back that savings estimate there. We don't need to do it if it doesn't make sense. However, I've reframed that conversation. And part of this reframing, once again, gets us into that negotiation leverage. And this is now, for everyone, an internal negotiation between procurement and IT, right? So you're going to negotiate on these various levels. However, through listening, having data available, here's how that conversation then shifted. Hey, CIO, I completely understand that you want me to take savings quickly off of my category management strategy. However, one of the things that you mentioned was upgrading and optimizing the organization to SAP for HANA. And part of that process will be scrapping all of this old shelfware technology. We've had all these software programs that we're just not utilizing at all. Some of them haven't been used in over 2 years. There's some of them that we have way more licenses for than we really needed. We purchased 200 in the beginning. We're only using about 5. I said to her, what if part of this savings and optimization focuses in on our current environment and links back to what you are trying to get done? she at the time had this initiative where she was handing out tiny trash cans to her team members that would offboard old software. They would display them on their desk, and it was kind of a little fun game where if you walk around the office, the person with the most tiny trash cans on their desk, you knew that they were doing a really good job of getting rid of all this old stuff. I said, I can help you with that. I've got data, I've got asset management resources that help us understand our entire environment. I've got cloud platforms that help us understand our consumption, usage, and ingestion. I've got the tools to help you reach this everybody's got a trash can on their desk goal and offboarding all of this old stuff. And that's when her eyes lit up. That's when she said, that's what I want you to spend your time on. And I said, all right, the data here, right? If we were to look at your planned obsolescence and planned migration away from this old technology, and I put the numbers to it, we can probably save about 15-20% of our total operations. Mind if I put that in there so that we can track our progress against your goal? And she says, fantastic. I don't know why you didn't have that in there before. Part of that conversation, then, right, everyone, is how do we make sure that we're framing this conversation properly so that we do have the right amount of leverage moving forward? I had a savings goal in there before the conversation started, but without it being framed to fit her objectives and goals, it did not land. It did not make sense. It was not something that she would sponsor or get on board for. But once that same goal, then I could, in that situation, actually increase that goal amount, increase the amount of dollars that we're saving and that we're planning to save, but it then had to be aligned with what her goal was, right? Once again, that same concept, that same example can be applied to internal or external stakeholders. This could be a conversation with a supplier that says, well, what's in it for you? Aside from wanting us to spend more money, how can we as an organization help you? And the answers that you might get back could surprise you if you started doing this with all of your strategic suppliers. And I would make that note, everybody, for everybody that's watching this, if you want to do one thing differently, ask your suppliers, what can I do for you to make our relationship better? And then watch how your leverage starts to transform. But once again, this is all conversation, data gathering, internal alignment that happens before that first supplier conversation. Now, where does this start to matter more? And why did I choose this topic now, particularly, right? Well, tariffs, once again, back in the news, back being the bane of so much of our existence here, artificial price increases in many situations that see the cost going up with the only clear connector being the tariff that is attached to it. Not rising costs across the board or scarcity of resources, but simple governmental intervention that simply says there is now a new tax on this thing that you are importing, right? So the cost of goods are going up. You're going to need that more efficient leverage overall to operate better in this environment. Conversely, we're still seeing inflation. I went to, like I said before, I go to the grocery store with my wife all the time. I'm the guy that carries all the groceries, right? But in the back of my head, I'm also the procurement guy saying, I don't think that that cost that much last month. And you can see this happen across the board in so many ways. You might even see licensing providers talk about inflation being the reason that your per seat license costs are going up. If you're not a part of it, ISM does release a monthly barometer report that talks about the CPI index as well as various other price index that we are tracking and how that is being affected by various changes in the economy. And what we can see is that these price pressures continue to push pricing in various volatile upward moving directions. And then lastly, the part here of why today is the global risks that are involved, especially when you think about how much critical risk is concentrated in a small number of suppliers. We need to find ways to better combat these four pieces that we see on the screen here and getting that more inline leverage before that negotiation is going to be key here. And once again, everybody, toward the end of this, I'm going to show you a quick one screen dashboard that will show you exactly the types of information that you should be pulling together before those conversations, right? As I said in the beginning, though, the more information that you can walk into that meeting with, the better outcome you will have. You do not want your supplier being the only source of truth that you have for that project. Imagine a supplier comes to you, imagine it's Microsoft, right? And they simply say, well, with the increased usages of AI, our own Copilot AI, all of the NVIDIA GPUs costing more, your licenses are going to go up. If you only have what they're telling you, there's very little rebuttal that you have in order to improve your leverage in that conversation. So before you get into that talk, there are six key questions here that I want to make sure that you can answer before you have that conversation, right? So if you're going in and you know you're going to talk about costs, I want you to be able to break down in as many ways as you can what makes up that exact cost. And then for any potential claims that that supplier can make against it, that is then what you're researching. Going back to the Microsoft example, right? So if they say, hey, our costs are going up, and that's why you're going to see your seat or your per seat cost go up as well, ask them the question, well, which costs exactly are going up? When the pandemic first hit, I had many suppliers, especially because we were also experiencing high inflation. Some months I saw it hit 30%, right? If we're having these talks and we have a supplier that says, hey, the pandemic and inflation and working from home and then the tariffs and now people going back to office, that's really increasing our costs. I had this conversation with a couple suppliers. The first one was Concur, SAP Concur, who make their money when people travel. So they were going to increase our costs for our renewal by about 20%. And they were claiming the environment. They said costs are going up and blah, 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 blah. I said, how much? Which costs of yours are directly being impacted? They could not provide me with a good answer. Instead, I was looking at their financial reports, their income and balance sheets, and I saw that during the pandemic, two things happened. Because they make money when people travel, and travel was closed down at the time, they were losing a lot of money, right? Their income and revenue was just nowhere near as strong as it was before. The second thing that they were doing is heavily investing in their technology at the time, revamping their dashboards, revamping their user interfaces and whatnot. And we could determine then that in a combination of decreased revenue and increased investment, that was why our pricing was going up. So the conversation then shifted from here's why you're going to be hit with an increase to, hey, we are not going to pay for your company's ill-managed business practices and then you guys just not performing well. Now, what we can do as a partner here, right, because this negotiation is supposed to be double-sided, we said we're not going to be paying for all this stuff that we shouldn't be, but we are willing to accept a nominal price increase because we do understand times are hard, inflation does exist, and your costs may be going up. However, even with our very nominal agreed upon price increase that we'll be giving you guys, we want to ensure that we're going to get our money's worth. We want to see where you guys are investing at, how this will push back on us, how we will benefit from that investment, because we don't want to just be throwing money down a black hole there. The other five questions are all around how do we break down exactly where the costs are coming from and how that overall relates to not just the market, which is extremely important, but also to our business. Imagine you know the geographical impact of cost on your business, right? So if you're in a, let's say, for example, you're in California and you're working with certain companies that require a large amount of on-site IT specialists. Well, we know that in California specifically, that type of skill may be abundant. How can the geography of our business and of our need help with our situation? These questions are the answers that you need to walk into your first internal stakeholder conversation, either asking or having some sort of general idea of what the answer is. And the reason I say that is, as a procurement person, I don't want you guys just to be data gatherers or question askers. You are your stakeholders trusted advisors as they move through and try to navigate very complex deals that they need your help with. Your job then is to validate, collect, and repurpose information around that supplier, the market, and your company, and how you can directly apply all of that to it. So, what do we think about when it comes to how do we get that research actually done? I look at primarily these four areas. You can have more, you can find more, but these are the key areas that I have here. Now, supplier intelligence, I have that first. Now, when I say supplier intelligence, I don't always mean, but I do sometimes mean getting on the phone and asking the supplier, right? Talking to them, just collecting data, figuring out what they're willing to share. On the flip side, though, is figuring out what's been posted in that area by that supplier, whether that is their financial team. If they're a public company, this is even sweeter, right? You can find so many details on them simply because they're required to post that. I want you to walk into that meeting having looked through their website, having downloaded their balance sheets, having understood where have they been in the recent news stories, if there has been anything in there that might affect their cost or price, if they've been suspected of having an upcoming IPO or an upcoming merger or acquisition. Know all of those details before going in. And you may think to yourself, well, Brendan, how do I do that right before a meeting? This is the practices and exercises that you should be doing weeks in advance and sometimes, right? You should know when your next big negotiation is coming up. Next, we have market benchmarks. Very obvious one here, but you are comparing what that company is offering versus what the market is offering. And in these situations, you're not only doing pricing, but you're also understanding what are their product development roadmap trends for this particular market or this particular product, right? What are the cost factors going in for this particular market? Once again, I've been in IT now for well over a decade, so all of my example, well, primarily my examples will be in that area. And I still think about when I see some of the bigger tech companies laying off people, what sort of trend does that mean for the commodities or the talent or the human resources that I may be purchasing? If I know Facebook just laid off 11,000 engineers, well, that's 11,000 engineers that have now been added to the market. How will that affect if I'm reaching out to an IT MSP, managed service provider, and saying, I need X amount of resources, can you get them on site for me, right? So that part matters too. Then we have the internal spend usage and the patterns that you have within your own organization. Do you, so here's a real example where this came into very good use for me while negotiating on the semiconductor and cloud infrastructure route. So imagine your AWS, your Microsoft Azures. Those are our cloud platforms. If you have Microsoft Teams, for example, and you have shared drives, you probably have Microsoft Azure. You're probably saving your files on some sort of shared drive that everybody in the organization can access if you give them a link, or let's say you leave the company, all your stuff is saved in a place where multiple computers can access it, right? If you have the data around here's what our internal spend looks like for our cloud usage and ingestion and the consumption, right? So the more you use those shared drives, the more expensive it will be. Same thing for many AI situations. Let's say you look at your trend data and you say, well, over the last 12 months, we've spent, $2 million on ingestion capacity and storage, right? So let's say we had those three categories and we said we spent 2 million on that. Now that 2 million is a very flat number. The internal spend is then going to help us say, all right, well, how much did we spend in each of those individual categories? And then when did we spend those things? Maybe I saw a huge spike certain times of the year that then have a misrepresentation of the data that they have. So here's how this would break down in a practical sense, and I'll try to explain it so that even if you're not in IT, you might be able to understand this. If you are using 2 million, let's just call it ingestion. Let's say you're spending $2 million on your cloud environment, saving stuff, moving stuff, putting apps on the cloud platform, whatever you're doing, you're spending $2 million a year doing that. But let's say in quarter one, your spend is $1 million. And in quarter two, it's 0.25. And in quarter three, it's back up to 1 million. And in quarter four, it's back down to 0.5, something along those lines, or 0.75, whatever it could be. The point of understanding how that cycle goes is then you're able to negotiate with that supplier on a much more strategic level. They may say, well, Brandon, you're spending $2 million right now. The trend of last quarter says that you were up 25% from the previous quarter, meaning that you might continue to grow 25% quarter after quarter. By understanding the spend data, I'll be able to say, well, actually, that was only in the ingestion period, right? And we had a product release in Q1 that caused that spike to go up. Whenever there's not a planned product release, we see it typically drop to 25% of when it is. We had a second product release in Q3 that saw another spike in usage. But then once again, we found some optimization strategies and we were able to internally get that usage back down to reasonable levels. And therefore, for our renewal, there shouldn't really be a plan to increase consumption because our usage was situational based. And because you understand that, because you know where that fits into your overall category and cycles, you are not then going to be controlled by the supplier narrative that's simply saying, we need to buy more, we need to do more in that space. And then if we can't do those things, always having the alternative would be very helpful for us. We have about, keep me honest here, Kathy, but I think we have about 20 minutes or so left, if I'm not mistaken here.
Uh, actually about 15.
15. All right. I'm going to, yeah, the time is flying. I'm going to speed ahead in some of these areas here. And once again, everybody, if you do have some questions, feel free to put that in the chat. Once again, I'm mostly an IT expert. So if there are other things that you wanted to focus in on or ask, feel free to let me know there. So the leverage here, I'm gonna, like I said before, move along a little bit more and talk about like really where and how to get to the stakeholder alignment. The biggest piece with the cloud example that I gave you guys before, understand your environment first. Understand what are the goals and objectives of those stakeholders, then that you can work into your overall plan. If we have things that we are able to commit to, get those numbers down. If you know that your finance team is extremely conservative and they like to put growth at very modest levels, that is how you then adjust your strategy. And you don't go into, let's say your numbers may show that you're going to grow the use of that product or that service by 25%. If your company is conservative and they're saying 5%, you go with the 5. But you still need to know and understand both of those numbers. If growth is something that is aggressive, that you guys are targeting, that you're saying we cannot afford to grow less than 10%, that has then become a lever for you that you can use in that conversation. Knowing when to walk away, obviously, is a really big piece. And then I want to give you guys a couple examples of two examples, right, of how this can look like in, once again, your personal life and then procurement. And then I'm going to walk into some examples around what can you actually show some of your stakeholders here. So was out on the town with my wife. We stopped by a restaurant. We said, "Hey, this is a great place." She looked it up prior, said that she really wanted to eat there, and we started to get a little bit of flack because she wanted to go somewhere else before we sat down to eat. And that means we would have then had to change some of our reservations. It was an extremely busy night at that restaurant. And they said, "Hey, we're fine with changing some reservations. And also, this is out of the country. So the rules here were a little bit different than I would typically see in the US." They asked for a deposit, right? They said, "Hey, can you put down some money to hold your table and it'll simply be applied when you eat, unless you're not planning to come back," right? So I turned away. I had a conversation then with my wife and I said, "Are we sure we're going to come back to this restaurant?" And she says, "Well, yeah, I really want to eat here. That's fine with me. I would love to come back to this place." And I said, "All right, if we're sure about this, then there are things then that I can do in this situation. If we are unsure, that then changes my strategy. We are sure we're coming back. I'll put down the money. I'll put down the deposit. I'll tell them that we're coming back. I'll give them a time frame for when we'll come back. I'll tell them the general dishes to make sure that we're having a conversation prior to, if they're not on the menu, then I probably won't come back, but I need to know that before I give you the deposit." So I checked in with my key stakeholder, right? We communicated on what are your needs and wants in this situation, right? They have what you want on the menu. We're sure we're going to come back. I framed the negotiation around that. Now, if we were thinking about that for a software renewal, if I know my volume is going up, and I know that we're going to onboard a ton of new users, and I know that we're going to put this product in several different places, I can make that commitment then using that alignment. And those are some of the conversations that then happen before it even starts with the suppliers. Now, if we get into that conversation, let's say we're talking to the restaurant, my wife and I are standing side by side, and she starts to say, "Well, I don't know if we're going to come back. I really am also thinking about eating at this other place down the street. And I also wanted to go potentially see a movie before we eat." And now all of these different things are happening where we may not be able to agree. The supplier does two things. One, they understand that we're not aligned. And the divide and conquer strategy is very strong on the sales side, right? If they can just get a few yeses, then it's fine. And they may not need the full yes. He may only be pushing to get our deposit down at that stage. Once the deposit is there, they have a guaranteed customer or they simply have guaranteed money, right? Now, where this starts to matter then is as the procurement person, how do you juggle and balance these varying stakeholder opinions so that you can still present on that united front? It always will need to involve that pre-meeting, but then you bringing the facts in, predicting some of the questions that they could ask, and predicting how to adjust to that. So business unit A says, well, the usage will grow. Business unit B says that it'll stay flat. Finance says, well, we need to control the costs. And operations says that we need flexibility. How do we get to a minimally viable negotiation strategy that keeps them all in mind and then under control? Well, the first one is if we know that we'll grow, we'll leave some options in there for us to grow. So let's go back to the cloud example and we can kind of put this into a perspective. We are only going to commit to flat growth. That is what we will commit. However, we are going to negotiate that if we grow by more than 5%, we want X% discount as if we had started at that 5% growth agreement, right? So we are capturing the benefit from growing. We are capturing the risk mitigation from staying flat. And then when finance and operations talks about this, we can say, well, also we've worked in the ability to scale up and down some of those usage points while rolling over previously unused credits to apply to the future, giving us some flexibility and allowing us to just pay that one consistent cost. We may sometimes overpay slightly, but anytime that we are underutilizing it, that carryover balances out on the balance sheet for us. So, sorry, that alignment gets rid of that uncertainty and then moves us into that confidence that we need to have. And we're going through our standard procurement questions, devising out what are your must-have, nice-haves, what can we replace, and when do we actually want to walk away from these situations here. Now, here's where I would start to take a screenshot if you need to, right? So this is where I would say you're putting together the framework that you will use to have some of those conversations, right? You're putting together the ideas of here are the questions I need to ask, here's the alignment that I need to find, here are the data and the facts that I need to bring in to push this forward and land it in a spot that I want it to land in. We have a quick question from Sandeep here. How does the strategy change when you're negotiating with a single or sole source who are well aware of their position? They're also aware that qualifying potential new suppliers could take 2 to 3 years. A couple things here. I'm going to tell you a quick story, Sandeep. I saw a recent story, and this isn't even too recent that this happened, but there was a French government that got rid of Microsoft and decreased their total cost of ownership by 40%. They did this over 10 years. So, Sandeep, when you're walking into your conversations with those sole source providers, I believe that the leverage that you would need to have is a couple fold. So, let's start with the internal stakeholders. The first one is, hey guys, if we had a 5-year roadmap, would it be feasible to get away from the supplier? Right. And before you even ask them that question, do your research and say, all right, I've seen other companies handle it this way. I see these other options out there in the market. If we were to go with these other options, here are the 10 different things that I foresee we'll have to kind of get together in our own house. We may have to do some tech upgrades. You need to figure out what the ROI is on that. Then when it comes to kind of finishing off that internal alignment, you then have a decision that says from your stakeholder group, well, yes, we can offboard them in 5 years if all of these steps happen first. And then when you're having that conversation with the supplier, you can confidently say, yeah, we're going to renew with you this year. However, next year, I cannot say that will be the same thing. When I deal with sole source suppliers, I often also put them on annual contracts. And a lot of people say that's converse to what the standard procurement practice would be, which is if you have a sole source vendor, you want to put them on a long-term contract, lock that relationship in. I prefer to maintain leverage by keeping them on their toes with saying, I'm doing the research, I'm finding the alternatives, and I'm keeping us agile enough to know that if you guys were to mess up, here's the direction that we're going to go. I may even propose, can we do a make versus buy analysis? They're the only ones out there. Can we figure out how to get this in-house? Maybe we need additional expertise. Thirdly, I would also kind of pitch the idea of potentially investing in their competition. Imagine if the barrier for entry is so high that the only reason that they're a sole provider in that space is there haven't been other companies that see the financial gain of getting involved. If you start talking about, hey, I've gone to this conference, and you guys are the only provider here, but there's this other company that's trying to do the same thing, and we're thinking about providing them an investment to increase that competition and potentially find alternatives. That could be another way. So in my opinion, when dealing with sole source, you want to employ these multiple strategies that tell them you're not completely locked in. You're doing the research so that you can kind of back that up a little bit, but it will involve you directly telling them, yes, we will have to renew with you this year. But then still, once again, framing that leverage around that may not be the case for the future there. So hopefully that answers your question, Sandeep. And I do think that that kind of moves us into some of these next segments here, which is, and once again, this could also be another screenshot that I want you guys to take, which fully talks about here are the exact points that you guys want to map out in your own organization, those pre-stakeholder calls and conversations that you need to have prepared. Once you're able to do this, those initial stakeholder conversations become a lot easier. So everything on here touches on what you should be gathering up for us. And then I also have this slide here. Kathy, I'm fine with sending this to you after so that you can get this out to all the members here. But to me, these are the areas that you follow in order to kind of craft the right messaging, ensure that you're aligned with your stakeholders, and then answering the right questions before you get on that call. And once again, it doesn't need to be perfect. You just need to know generally where things are going there. Now, with that being said, I know that we only have like 7 minutes left, everybody. What I want to do here is show you how we do this internally at Valorant with some of our clients and see if this is going to be worthwhile for you guys. So I believe you guys should now be looking at a dashboard, correct? And somebody just put yes in the chat if you guys are now.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. So this is what we use at Valorant. It's called Astra. It's our homegrown platform. If you ever wanted to talk to me more about this, feel free to do that. But this is what I would recommend if you are stepping into a stakeholder conversation as procurement, here is the additional value that you can bring. I gave a talk at this last ISM World Conference that we just had in Denver, and my entire talk was around how does procurement get a better seat at the table. The entire presentation that we went over today was all around you need to start those conversations with your internal stakeholders, ask the right questions, collect the right data. At the end of it all, everybody, this, what you see on the screen, could be then what you're working with. Now, you could do this in Excel. You could do this through PowerPoint. You can do this manually. And that is really what I recommend you do in the beginning, right? You do this, you get the process down right, so that every time you're thinking about how can procurement be more valuable? How can I get the invite from my stakeholders prior? This is what you're doing, right? At a glance, you should be able to show your stakeholders everything that you see on the screen here. You want to be able to quickly show them, here's what we're spending by category. This is something that I would find a lot more helpful for like the CIOs or the department heads that want to get that bigger picture view of everything, especially your heads of procurement, right? And more especially if you're trying to make the business case that procurement is bringing nominal and monetary value, right? So if you've gone through, and I've seen people kind of use dashboards like this to justify not having layoffs, right? If you can push for the fact that says, hey, you know, we've handled 383 projects since the beginning of the year, that sort of information is extremely valuable. So you're starting with something like this, everybody. You're starting with showing them a potential category management plan and strategy that just lays out all of the details, all of the information, your savings, your engagements, and whatnot. But then you're taking a deeper dive into it. Let's say you're on a particular category, you're jumping into your category, you're talking about how, well, hey, here are the suppliers that we have in the space, and here's where in many places this starts to connect. If I'm then negotiating with, let's say, once again, a Coupa, for example, this is the part where I start to gather information about Coupa's market. What area do they play in? How much are we spending across the category for that tool and then similar tools? And then most importantly, when you finally step into those stakeholder conversations, here's the key slide, the key page rather, that you should have prepared. Now, in our system, this does it for us automatically, right? To me, that's why I love using this thing. And once again, if you want to have a conversation about using it too, that's fine. We can talk after, but you can do this without the software. I will say that. If you want talk to talk around like how to actually set this up without software, I'm also happy to do that. But essentially, here's the value that you're bringing in to that first stakeholder conversation so that you can ask those questions, but then also display information. Because what I don't want you to do, everybody, is just go in there with questions. I want you to go in there with questions and being armed with information that adds to the context there, that then allows you to connect back what your stakeholders are telling you to the overall strategy. So this is material price intelligence for this particular material supplier. We also see certain types of vendor information here. So look at this. So I have all my vendor details for all the different materials for this particular commodity. I see where the pricing is going. I can quickly then point out and say, all right, well, this one here being on that green space is quite different than some of the other suppliers that are showing rising costs in various areas. And then as I break it down to the exact material level, so imagine I'm negotiating steel or corrugated wire or whatever I'm negotiating, all of a sudden now I have all of this at my fingertips. This is the research that I want you to do, this type of research, before you step into those calls, right? I want you to understand, where are the pricing trends going with this? Is there anything that's happened in the news that can affect how that company works and what that pricing looks like? And I want you to then produce some sort of recommendation for how we should modify the strategy based on the data that you have available to you. So if I'm thinking about this in terms of, this is Microsoft, for example, what I would then be doing is saying, all right, I found data that shows how companies have handled the trend of Microsoft licenses increasing. I have data that shows that Microsoft is trying to move people from that E5 license to the E3, meaning instead of just getting your Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, you're now getting Publisher and a ton of other tools that you may not need. I'm seeing the trend in people getting rid of their support agreements and opting for third-party support from Microsoft. Like, I'm bringing that information into that first stakeholder meeting so that, one, they get more ideas on how they can apply it to their strategy. But for two, I'm coming in there now as a trusted, valuable resource that adds to what the stakeholder is doing, and not just serving as another paper pusher or somebody that's just there to cut the PO. I want a strategic seat at that table, and the only way that I'll be able to get there is by bringing them that additional information and then asking the right questions in that first conversation so that I can add to that overall strategy. So I know that we're at time. I really hope that helped everybody. Once again, if you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out. I'm always available over at Valorant. I can help you put together this type of thing outside of the software. Or if you are looking at software, I'd be happy to do that. Or if you just want to throw some ideas around, maybe you are dealing with a complex IT negotiation or something on the indirect side of negotiation, and you just want to say, hey, Brandon, how have you or other clients done XYZ? I'd be super happy to answer those questions and work with you guys on that front. But I'm going to pause there. I did a ton of yapping. I would have loved to leave more time for questions at the end, but I feel like we were having a great time. And with that being said, Kathy, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back on over to you if you would like to close us out.
Oh, definitely. Thank you, Brandon. I really appreciate this. The great presentation. A lot of questions were coming out of it. And yes, please, if you can send the slides to me, I will then send it to everybody in the post email with the recording.
All right.
Okay, thank you so much. And everybody have a great day. And I'm glad you were able to join us today.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.